Hi everyone. For today's episode, we're covering two more fundamental principles of geology. We're looking at the law of superposition and the law of original horizontality. Now, those are two very fancy sounding terms, but they're actually quite simple. The law of superposition is simply that the older rock layers are below the newer ones. This makes sense as new rock layers get deposited on top of old rock layers, not underneath them. Now, original horizontality is honestly even simpler. It really just means that rock layers get deposited horizontally, not vertically or at an angle. And if a rock layer is shifted up at an angle, something occurred after deposition to put it that way. Now, these rules are all well and good, but how do we apply them? We can use these rules to figure out the geologic history of a region. If we look at a cross section of a region's geology, we can determine the history of it. We can tell which rock layers formed first based on relative depth. We can tell when deformation events happen by looking at which layers are no longer horizontal, which ones got deformed. We can even tell when faults and igneous intrusions happen based on what rock layers they cut through. Now let's take a look at an example. Let's look at this example and see if we can figure out the geologic history. Pause the video here and see what order you think the features in this section formed in. Got it? Good. Let's check your answers. The first thing to form is this metamorphic basement rock. Then, the imaginary limestone and example sandstone are deposited on top of that. Then, the igneous intrusion formed. We can tell it must have formed after the first three units because it cuts through those layers. Next, fault A formed. Again, we know this because it cuts through those bottom three layers as well as the intrusion, but not those two layers above it. After that, the hypothetical shale was deposited and the quaternary alluvium on top of that. Now let's try a more complicated one. Once again, pause the video and see if you can figure it out. Figured it out? Let's see if you were able to get it. All the layers except the quaternary alluvium are folded. Based on original horizontality, we know that all those layers then must have been deposited before that fold formed. Neither the fault nor the igneous intrusion are deformed by the fold, so they must have formed after it. So the imaginary limestone, example sandstone, hypothetical shale, and fake dolostone formed first. Then fold X. After that, things get a little uncertain. We know fault A must have formed after fault B because fault B cuts through fault A, cutting it into two parts. But we don't know whether the igneous intrusion formed before or after these faults because neither one cross-cuts the other. So we can't really know their relative ages based on the cross-section alone. Then, of course, the last unit deposited was the quaternary alluvium. Now, these examples were, of course, just made-up instances. Real-world geologic cross-sections are often considerably more complex than the ones I showed here. But I hope now you understand a couple of the techniques geologists use to establish geologic histories of a region. That's all for this episode. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and consider subscribing. I really do appreciate it. And if you'd like to suggest a topic for a future episode, leave a comment. Till next time.